Not Leni, Leni, sorry. And thank you so much for joining us on Facebook Live. It's really lovely to have you with us. How are you enjoying the UK and the UK weather?
I'm loving both things. I mean, I'm a huge Anglophile, so I love it here. But also, I live in Oregon, which over the summer, it's been like 98 degrees and sunny the entire summer.
Oh, nice.
So I was really hoping for rain when I came here.
You should move here permanently because we have that all the time.
Yeah. Well, in Oregon, we have a lot of rain too, but just not in the summer.
Oh, yeah.
So when I was in Edinburgh for the festival and it was raining. I was very happy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So we're here to talk about the lovely RedClocks, which has such an incredible cover. Yeah, it's so evocative and just like mind-grabbing. Like it grabs your attention straight away. It's so good.
The designer Lauren Harms is just a genius book designer. Like as soon as I saw it, I knew.
we all love this cover. Like it's hard not to want to pick it up when you're in a bookstore and see that cover and be like, oh, what's that about? Like it looks really interesting. And speaking of, like you've probably addressed this in interviews before, but where did the idea for RedClocks come from, like as a concept?
Yeah, kind of from a few different places. I started writing it in 2010, and in my personal life, I was dealing with a lot of questions around wanting to become a mother, dealing with infertility, having to go to a lot of doctors and sort of figure out how kind of far I wanted to go in reproductive technology to help me get pregnant. And I was feeling a lot of kind of confusion and anxiety, and I wanted to put that somewhere. And so I put it into first an essay that I was writing. And it involves stuff like the history of fertility treatments and how, OBGYN or the equivalent in ancient Greece, talked about the womb and, all kinds of different research things. And that didn't actually go anywhere. It didn't feel like the right vehicle for what I wanted. So out of that came this character who turned into the biographer, someone who does want to become a mother, but also is questioning why she wants that, and is she kind of simply playing out this sort of trajectory that society has given her that she's supposed to want. And so once I had her character, I just started imagining other characters for her that would be kind of in contrast, like foils for her. Like the wife character in RedClocks came pretty early on, as did the mender, and I imagined a triangle of women, and I wanted to write about female friendship and the sort of strangeness of it and complexities of it. So that's where the germ came from. And then it was also a chance to use my kind of personal obsession with witchcraft and witch persecution, and have a character who was seen by other people as a witch. So there's one theory of novel writing is that I think it was the poet Keith Waldrop, who also had written a novel. He said a novel is where you put everything that's kind of captured your attention for the last 5 years of your life, and I think that does happen a lot, that it's not just this one thing you can focus on, but it's where a writer gets to put kind of all of her obsessions, So.
I love that, and I'm a massive fan of multiple narratives, so it really keeps my attention when there's loads of different characters. And one of my favourites was the biographer, actually, as well. And the opening chapter where she goes to buy the pills is actually one of my favourites.
Oh,
because
cool.
of what's said to her at the end of the chapter by the guy when she's like, can't you just give them to me for free? And he's like, I can't, I'm sorry. Well, his line is a bit more funny than that, but, for the children who are watching. Do you have any favourite characters, actually, that when you were writing, you're like, oh my gosh, I love this character so much, I'd like to be friends with them?
I feel the most sort of affinity with the biographer, just in terms of her sense of humor, and there's a lot of difference in between us biographically, but there's some similar things as well. But the character who I think I had kind of deeply fond of, but also who was more difficult to write, was the mender, because when I first wrote her character, it was kind of too distant and exoticizing, I think. She's for people who haven't read the book, she lives by herself off the grid in the forest and sustains herself mostly from food that she forages and finds, and is not interested in being part of society. And that's something I really admire about her as a character. But in early drafts of the book, I think I wasn't making her complicated enough. I just was, she was almost this symbolic, eccentric, weird character, and I didn't want to do that sort of reductive, some sort of one note thing to her. So, but writing her kind of obliged me to do a lot of research about, edible plants, things that I had no knowledge of, I'm not a hiker. I'm not a major outdoor person.
Neither.
So I learned a lot of cool stuff about things you can eat that don't come from the supermarket.
What's the most interesting thing that you found that you could eat that's not?
There's something that I don't know what its scientific name is, but it's known as a ghost pipe, and it looks like albino asparagus. It's just this stalk of white, and if you can cook it with lemon and butter, and it tastes really good, but if you eat too much of it, it can kill you.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So, it's it could serve in a metaphoric kind of way for a lot of things. In moderation, it's okay. But but I've never actually eaten it myself. So that's in the future.
Maybe when you're out there in the woods doing the hiking that we both love to do.
Yeah.
And actually, it's funny because I started off with the mentor being like, oh, why are you being so weird? Why can't you just fit in? Then I was like, no, actually, it's really nice that you're just yourself. And one of the things I loved about her was that even when, I don't want to be too much of a spoiler, but when so-and-so was on the stand, and when she had to go on the stand, she still didn't say anything and she still didn't sort of give it all up. And I was like, oh, you're such a good person. And I'm always, whenever I read a book and I really get personally involved with the characters. And I just really enjoyed that she was really true to herself the whole time, and she never was thinking I'm going to conform or be exactly the way you want me to be. She was just herself, and it was really beautiful.
Thank you.
And one of the other things that I loved about the book, which I'm sure everyone else loves, is the title, which is also really evocative. And the moment you see it, you're like, what is that about? What's RedClocks? And when I read it, I'm like, now, having read it, I think to myself, oh, it must be about this and a ticking clock on this or ticking clock on that. But then I'm like, actually, there are so many different layers to it. But what was your inspiration for the title? How did you come with the title?
It came from the Mender, actually, when I was writing, kind of in her voice or sort of borrowing her voice for the third person narration. It occurred to me that that's how she might name the uterus, the red clock, it's bloody and it's kind of red or pink with life, but also it's a clock in that it keeps time. The idea of the menstrual cycle and the kind of different phases that it goes in. So, and then shortly after I thought of that, I thought also biological clock, this notion of kind of pressure on a woman to sort of go through certain steps in her life by a certain time that men just are have
there's no time constraints. Nothing that holds them.
And, they could some men I guess could impregnate someone at age 80 or something. But even and then kind of getting more abstract or maybe associative, this sort of kind of notion of also history and cycles of history and ways in which we inherit things that were set in motion by other people. And I think that's where the biographer's interest in the polar explorer kind of comes in. This woman who no one's ever heard of, who lived in the 19th century and did things that, it wasn't, landing on the moon, but it was contributing to our understanding of the polar regions and the question of sort of how she fits into the tapestry of history. And so the clock had that evocation for me too.
Yeah. I really like that. And it's really easy to, it's actually found it a lot easier to say to people, oh, you should read this book. And they're like, what's it called? They're like, RedClocks. And they're like, that's interesting. I'll pick it up.
That's good. They're not like, oh, that sounds terrible.
Yeah, no, it's such a good title. It's actually, it's really interesting because I feel like with titles now, they get quite long. You get long titles with loads of words. And I want something that can be like, what's it called? Or like, you should read this, or this, rather than you should read the story of the tale of the person who lived in it, kind of thing.
And the wife of the thing. Like,
yeah, exactly.
You know,
So great title. Well done.
You like the 2-syllable titles.
Yeah, I do. I really do. And apparently the 2 name as well. I do like a bit of a name in a title as the name of a... So we're talking about Stephen Florett. I really like the 1, 2.
Yeah.
That's definitely my thing. And in terms of like when I was saying it's easy to pitch the book to people, what's the best reader response you've had from people who've read the book?
Oh, yeah. I've had a lot of great kind of talks with individual readers about what the book has meant to them. One that stands out for me is a woman who came up to me after a reading and said that she'd read my book and then left an abusive relationship.
Oh, wow.
And of course, it wasn't just the book. I mean, I know that there were a lot of other factors in her life that led to that decision, but just the thought that in any small way that the book could have been part of her getting to a place of safety or liberation was like incredible. Like, I started crying, and then she cried a little bit, and you know. So I guess that it's strange, right? Because I think for writers, you know, I know I do focus a lot on craft and style and art, and those are crucial. I mean, those can't be kind of separated from the content or the feelings involved. But the thing that does hit me the most, I mean, it's great to be told, you know, someone likes the sentences and the style, but if someone has that really visceral, personal kind of reaction, that's the one that feels the most gratifying, you know, rather like, a pretty young woman actually at a reading I gave recently, she was talking about an abortion that she had had, and how she named sort of one line from a character in RedClocks who has an abortion, and she's like, yeah, that line felt true, you know, and that mattered to me, you know.
Yeah, because it's interesting because obviously once you've written the book, you don't really have any control over it once it's out in the world. Yeah. But the fact that those words are still sort of alive and they can connect with people in that way is really, I can imagine that's quite emotive and quite an emotional thing.
Yeah.
And obviously with things that are going on in the world today, when you go to readings and do events, do people say to you, are you psychic? Like, because things seem to be happening that are sadly leaning towards the way that things have happened in the book. And obviously when I've read, I think, a couple of interviews where you've said these sort of things were beginning to think like, oh, imagine if this happened, imagine if that happened. But did you ever think it could sort of come as far as it is now?
Definitely not while I was writing RedClocks. I mean, which was, you know, again, I started in 2010, so we were only a couple years into the Obama years, and it really did feel like an alternate reality, you know. I don't know if I would say dystopia in the sense that, I mean, there's different interpretations of that word, but it felt like something that could happen if a very fringe group of politicians in the U.S. kind of had their way. But then what happened with the Trump regime is that those fringe people like Mike Pence came to take very central positions in the governing of our country, which still, I mean, it's still really hard to believe, like, what a terrifying, like, horror show it has become, you know. But I think there's been a lot of sort of conservative movements and groups that, ever since January 1973, when Roe v. Wade, that decision came down from the Supreme Court, people have been figuring out how to reverse it and how to do the death by 1,000 cuts kind of, okay, even if we can't reverse Roe v. Wade, let's make rural women not be able to get terminations because they can't take enough time off their jobs to travel 300 miles to like the one clinic in their state or whatever. And so there've been a lot of ways in which that swell has been coming, but honestly, no, I wasn't thinking as I wrote it, especially the early drafts, of it reflecting reality as much as I was just imagining, okay, what would be a kind of core or elemental restriction to put on, or pressure to put on, a group of characters. And if they're women, that was pretty much the first thing I thought of is kind of restricting their ability to make decisions about their own bodies. And so, it's horrifying, like that some of it looks more and more like reality rather than fiction.
In fiction, yeah, which is quite scary. And I guess if people are watching and they're thinking, oh my gosh, this does seem sort of real, not so much advice, but the way that the characters in the book they haven't necessarily, it's not a closed book where they have this arc, it's a beginning, middle and end, and they sort of come over the other side, but the way that they handle things, and especially the daughter, that she's so strong. And another thing that really touched me was the biographer and taking the daughter. Don't want to ruin anything for anyone who hasn't read it yet, but they should have. But the sort of strength and dignity and things that they, the way that they carry themselves with all they're going through. How would you say, like, people in these times, in the times of like Me Too and things like that, what would you say to someone who's like, how do we sort of live in these times? And because obviously it's a fictional world that you've written about, but it feels so real now. If someone were going to ask advice, like, how do we react? How do we keep going? What would you say?
I love that question. When I was writing, especially the biographer and the daughter character, actually, I was thinking about, I didn't want to have characters who are already kind of totally politically active and savvy and involved. I wanted characters who had to actually kind of be jolted out of a certain, I wouldn't say stupor, but at least comfort and sort of insularity, and especially in a place like, the west coast of the U.S., Oregon, where there is a little bit of a sense of a bubble of, it's this beautiful state that's really far away from, the seat of power in D.C. And you can kind of get lulled into a complacency. And what I was trying to do with those characters in particular is to kind of bring them out of complacency, not to any triumphant, perfect place of like wokeness, but more just, oh shit, we really need to like figure something out, how to live differently. And I think maybe at the center of living differently is looking at sort of personal comfort and convenience versus a kind of greater principle or collective well-being. And I think that's the choice that the biographer faces of, she in her own life individually really, wants something, but to try to get that thing, it would be kind of going against someone else's well-being or her kind of political and ethical beliefs. And that's I think kind of a crisis in American culture in general. Not to sound too like sweeping about it, but there, we're having these debates now about, healthcare and other kinds of sort of social safety nets and support. And there's people who are going to vote against that because they'll save, $1,000 on their taxes. And it's the question of when can personal convenience and wealth be set aside for a greater good, So I have no answer about how that's going to happen, but I think that is a thing we're facing,
Yeah, that's a very good answer. And this is your third book, because you've got a first novel, you've got a story collection, and this is your third book. So every time you hand it over to your editor, or you hand over the copy edit back to your editor and say, okay, I'm giving this over to you now, and then you get to publication the day before, is it just as nerve-wracking every time you're doing it, or like what are the emotions you go through? Like, oh my gosh, someone might pick this up, someone might not pick this up, or people like this, or like, oh my gosh, this is my writing, I can't even do anything about it now because it's in print, or
there's always that the kind of vulnerability of exposure, definitely, and all three times it felt exciting for the book to come out, but really scary too, that people would be reading my words and judging or having a reaction. I went with RedClocks. I went through a much more involved revision process than I did with my first two books. And so there was a little bit of a sense of, I thought the first draft that I gave to, when we sold the book, that I gave to the editor was okay. But then when I saw her comments, I'm like, oh my God, like, yes, you're right. We have to, she was, Lee Boudreau, and also my editor here in the UK, Susie Doré, like, we're both had so many insightful, kind of large and small comments. And that scares me too, because I'm like, oh, but I thought the first draft was, because it wasn't my first draft, but it was the first draft I had shown that, I felt like I had taken it as far as I could. So, one could endlessly revise anything. But yeah, I think vulnerable is a good word. But with RedClocks, again, I'd sort of worked on it more in that sort of editorial process. So it felt a little less abrupt to let go of it on pub day.
What did you do on pub day? Well, on both your pub days, you had different pub days.
Well, in the U.S., I had a reading that night at Powell's, which is this kind of iconic bookstore in Portland, Oregon, and it was great because a lot of my friends and students and people came, and it felt good to do some kind of event, to get out of the solitary sort of, but I think also on publication day, I did a strange interview with like a local radio station, and getting back to your question about RedClocks, the guy who was, he was like very much like a DJ kind of, very like radio voice guy. And I could tell, he hadn't read the book, which is fine, but he was like, RedClocks. What is a red clock? Am I supposed to know what that is? And I'm like, no, but if you read the book, and again, it was it was like a pretty awkward interview that I did not listen to later. But it was a good reminder of like, okay, Leni, like, not everything is going to be perfect, obviously, but it was kind of good for that to happen on the first day. And then when it came out here in the UK, it was International Women's Day, which was just such a cool day.
It was perfect. When I found out, I was like, it was just made to come out on that day.
March 8th, yeah. And I found out the paperback's going to come out exactly a year later, so March 7th, which will also, it'll be close to International Women's Day. Yeah.
We'll make it work.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really exciting. And you mentioned that some of your students came to your reading. For those who don't know, Leni also teaches creative writing, is that right? Yeah. And what is that like? What is the experience of, first of all, how did you come into teaching creative writing? And also, what's it like being someone who does it as a profession and then also teaches it as a profession? Is that a strange sort of split?
It can be strange, yeah. I mean, I came to it, so in the States at least, if you do a graduate program in creative writing, often in order to pay for it, you teach a class like at the same university of, like, not necessarily even creative writing, but maybe composition writing to first years. So I got some training in teaching when I was in grad school, and when I left grad school and moved to New York, it was sort of the thing I could do to work as an adjunct instructor at a few different colleges there. So it's a strange thing to be a working writer and teach writing, because in one way it demands a kind of greater honesty from me to say, okay, if I'm telling my students this, do I believe it enough that I'm doing it in my own work? And it has happened on more than one occasion that I'll say something in class of like, this is the way to do this, and I realize I do it very differently. And so why am I telling my students to do it? Is it just because it's conventional wisdom and I need to think more rigorously about that, or maybe I should follow my own advice, So I think there's more of a regular occasion to question myself, and that's always kind of good. But there are times, as much as I love teaching, where I just think, oh, if I were doing something completely unrelated to writing, it would make it easier, just to, when I sit down at my desk, it'll feel kind of special in a way, And then other days I feel like, God, we should all just be reading. Like, that's really the only way to learn how to write, So I don't know. So I do a mix of both. I mean, I teach workshop classes, but I also teach kind of more literature-based classes.
And do you ever read some like work of your students and be like, oh my gosh, you need to write a novel, like you're amazing? Or...
Oh yeah, I have really talented students, both at the, in our MFA program and in undergrad. Yeah, and even, like all the time, I taught a 2-hour workshop at the Edinburgh Festival yesterday, and near the end of our 2 hours, some of they read some stuff they had written in that session, and it was beautiful. And it's so cool, just to see that, because I think for a lot of artists, a lot of writers, what they need is the kind of space and time and accountability. It's not that they can't already do something with language. It's that it's hard to put it in the center of your life. I mean, that's the reason I went to grad school for it, because I was working full time and I didn't know many people who wrote, and I just didn't know how to put it in the center.
Yeah. And speaking of good writers, something that I always like to find out is what some of my favourite writers, what their favourites are. So whether that's like books or films or like favourite thing you've ever read. So we're going to play a quick game of favourites. So what's your favourite song?
Shake Sugary by Elizabeth Cotton.
I've not heard it, but I will now listen to it.
Yeah. She's a really early, pretty early 20th century, singer and guitar player who taught herself to play the guitar.
Oh, wow.
She was a girl, and so she wasn't really no one was going to teach her, and she learned on her brother's guitar, and she was left-handed, so she had to flip the guitar over to play. She basically, made up a new way of playing guitar for herself.
Oh, wow. That's really cool.
Yeah.
And we just have one question. We've just had a question from Facebook, which is, what's your writing process? Do you sort of sit down, you know what you're going to write, or how do you?
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot at the beginning. I flail around a lot, and I'll look at the camera to answer your question. And I don't write chronologically, so even if I have a vague notion of an order of events, I'll just sort of skip around from moment to moment. So there's a lot of mess and disorganization in the first kind of chunk of writing a book, and then once I have some pages, then I go through and say okay, how are we going to arrange this? And that's one of the more pleasurable elements, the arranging. Once some of the raw material is there, and I can kind of play with it.
And how many drafts before you send it to your agent or before you show it to it? How many?
So many. I mean, again, because I don't go in a linear fashion, it's hard to separate one draft from another, but there's almost going to be not even a sentence that hasn't been changed somehow. I'm the opposite of the beat poets who, the first thought, best thought. My first thought's not my best. I mean, my first thought's important because it gets me to my 17th thought, but it's not my best thought, Well,
I'm glad that you had all these thoughts and they came together in this book. And last question is, what's your favourite book? Or even not even necessarily favourite thing you've ever read? Because sometimes that's an article or something like that as well.
Well, a writer that's incredibly important to me is Virginia Woolf, and one of her books that has been enduringly important is The Waves. When I first read it, it's like nothing I'd ever read before, because it's 6 voices speaking, but they're not in scenes with each other. It's almost like 6 people standing alone on a stage, speaking out, but they also know each other in the story. And actually, not all, but many of the names in RedClocks are taken from characters in The Waves. So I named the biographer Roe not after Roe v. Wade, but after Rhoda.
So I wondered, Buff. I thought to myself, I wonder if that's the same. That's interesting.
And then once I realized the Roe v. Wade thing, I'm like, I got to change it, but I didn't change it. So there it
I'm glad you didn't, because it's really great. Well, thank you so much for being here and for sitting down with us and for enjoying our terrible weather as well.
I love it. I love it here. And Ore, thank you so much for your wonderful questions.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely to have you on here. Wish we could do it forever, but sadly we can't. But thanks so much, and thank you all for watching.
Thank you.